over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
The Yanks were coming, all right. And we made damn sure that all the world would know. For Americans, it was a time for flexing our muscles and taking our place as a world power. It was a time for giants in America, with newspapers filled with legendary names like Flyer Eddie Rickenbacker and General Blackjack Pershing and Buffalo Bill Cody and millionaire Diamond Jim Brady. It was a time for something called jazz to change our whole concept of music, and for something called women's rights to begin changing our whole concept of life. It was 1917. Hello, I'm Dick Cavett. As 1917 dawned in America, Europe had been at war for almost 3 years, and the overwhelming public sentiment was for us to keep out. Life was pretty good for America's 103 million inhabitants in 1917, and who needed a war? On the farms, where just over half of us still live, things were just fine, even though this would be the last year that the rural population of America would exceed the number of city folk. And in those cities, things weren't too bad either. Of course, the average wage was only 24 cents an hour, but unemployment was only about 4%. And with bread at 9 cents a loaf, potatoes at 4 cents a pound, steak at 29 cents a pound, and a quart of milk delivered to your doorstep at 11 cents, that 24 cents an hour could go pretty far. And speaking of going pretty far, you could board a trolley car in New York City in 1917 and end up in Boston for a total fare of 5 cents. There was just one problem. There was war in Europe. It was coming at us whether we wanted it to or not. And it was being spearheaded by a silent, invisible, and deadly weapon the Germans called das U-Boot, the U-boat. Sehr gut, mein Kamerad. The Germans believed their sleek, swift submarines to be virtually invincible. And for a time, it seemed that they just might be. In the first 2 months of 1917 alone, the U-boats had sunk nearly 1 million tons of Allied shipping. And America knew full well that if it entered the fight, it would have to cross 1,000 miles of U-boat-infested ocean on a regular basis. America's fear and hatred of U-boats actually was born 2 years before, when the British luxury liner Lusitania set sail from New York to England on a wartime pleasure cruise. The huge liner was jammed with passengers when it sailed on May 1st, 1915, despite the fact that Germany took out ads in American newspapers openly warning that it might be attacked. 6 days later, as the Lusitania approached the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat struck. 1,198 persons were killed, including 128 Americans. The nation was outraged, and cries for war swept the land. Cooler heads, however, led by President Woodrow Wilson, would prevail. And by 1917, the nation was again overwhelmingly in favor of keeping out of the war.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let nations
Wilson's reaction to the Lusitania, coupled with scenes like these, lured Germany into making a fatal mistake. Believing that America would remain neutral at all costs, a note was handed to the U.S. on January 31st, declaring that Germany would attack any American ships carrying goods to Europe. Once again, the nation was outraged. And this time, President Wilson was too. War was inevitable. A few weeks later, another German mistake would provide the coup de grace to American neutrality. John Blackjack Pershing, America's top fighting general, was in Mexico at the time trying to capture Pancho Villa in retaliation for a raid staged on the United States a few months before. Pershing wasn't having much luck against the elusive Mexican enemy, but south of the border, anti-American sentiment was at a peak. And then, a secret German message was intercepted, which said that if the U.S. entered the war, Germany would ask Mexico to join with it in the fight against America. In return, Germany would restore to Mexico the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. General Pershing and his troops were called home immediately as America began its serious preparations for war. With the publication of the German message, the nation clamored for war. On April 2nd, Wilson called for an historic joint session of Congress to deliver one of the most stirring speeches in American history. "We will not choose the path of submission," declared the president. "The world must be made safe for democracy." The ovation from Congress was the greatest Wilson had ever received, and the general public was equally aroused. But for a man dedicated to peace, it was a personal tragedy. Later that night, he told a friend, "Think of what it was they were applauding. It was a message of death for America's young men." 4 days later, on April 6th, the Senate and House voted overwhelmingly to support a declaration of war. One of the few dissenting votes came from newly elected Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin. Just 4 weeks before, Miss Rankin had become the first woman ever elected to Congress, and despite public sentiment, she stayed with her beliefs, and her beliefs would stay with her. 25 years later, Miss Rankin would be the only member of Congress to vote against war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Despite the few dissenters, America was now at war. And now we had to figure out how to fight it. Only some 200,000 men were in uniform, a mere handful in terms of a world war, and even for them, there weren't enough weapons to go around. Americans had traditionally been hostile to conscription. It conjured up visions of armed soldiers going from door to door, dragging away young men. But under Woodrow Wilson, the draft would be run by civilians and publicized as a patriotic call to arms. June 5th was proclaimed National Registration Day, and every male between the ages of 21 and 30 was required to sign up for the draft. In order to lessen the shock, the sign-ups were not held at Army bases, but at a neighborhood polling place. It was as easy as going to vote. It went off with hardly a hitch. In the 12 hours between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. of that one day, over 10 million Americans did their duty.
It's time for every boy to be a soldier, to put his strength and courage to the test. It's time to place a musket on his shoulder and wrap the stars and stripes around his breast. It's time to shout those noble words of Lincoln and stand up for the land that gave you birth. That the nation of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
It was a part of a wave of wartime patriotism that swept the nation. People began calling dachshunds Liberty puppies, and sauerkraut was retitled Liberty cabbage. But the rock-ribbed residents of Berlin, New Hampshire, voted against changing the name of their hometown. Within 6 months, 500,000 new draftees were already in the Army, and more were coming every day. Life in the Army came as quite a shock to the new rookies, but most of them took it with good-natured humor. They even put up with that terrible tonsorial torture known as the Army haircut.
Good morning, Mr. Dip, 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 with your haircut just as sharp as mine. Good morning, Mr. Dip, 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 you're surely looking fine. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust, if a camel don't get you, the monkey must must. Good morning, Mr. Dip, 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 with your haircut just as sharp as mine.
You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning.
Of course, short haircuts weren't the only tribulations of Army life. Getting up at 5 o'clock every morning, for example, came especially hard, particularly for the city boys. One of them, a draftee at Camp Upton, New York, even wrote a song about it. His name was Irving Berlin.
I've been a soldier quite a while, and I would like to state the life is simply wonderful. The Army food is great. I sleep with 97 others in a wooden hut. I love them all. They all love me. It's very lovely, but oh, how I hate to get up in the morning. Oh, how I'd love to remain in bed. For the hardest blow of all is to hear the bugler call. You gotta get up, you gotta get up, you gotta get up this morning. Someday I'm going to murder the bugler. Someday they're going to find him dead. And then I'll get that other pup, the guy who wakes the bugler up.
And spend the rest of my life in bed.
A lot of American women in 1917 were also getting up unusually early. With the men away, and with war production gearing up at full blast, women were beginning to work at jobs that even just a few months before would have been strictly off limits. In Washington, D.C., for example, the nation's first female traffic cops appeared on street corners. On the farms, groups of young ladies who began plowing and hoeing and planting were called farmerettes. And in several cities, women for the first time began carrying the U.S. mails. Some of them completed their appointed rounds with 5-cent cigars clamped firmly between their teeth. The new roles being played by the nation's women gave a boost to the already growing women's rights movement. The main thrust of the movement was suffrage, granting women the right to vote. Women picketed the White House, urging Woodrow Wilson to back a suffrage amendment to the Constitution, and he quickly responded by announcing his support. On October 27th, over 20,000 women staged a suffrage parade in New York City, and just a week later, New York became the first state to offer equal voting rights to women. But it would still be 3 years before the amendment to the U.S. Constitution would finally be ratified. Fortunately, despite their quest for jobs and voting rights, American women never gave up their quest for beauty. And in 1917, these are the fashions that enhanced the beauties of the day.
Everybody loves a baby, that's why I'm in love with you. Pretty baby, pretty baby. And I'd like to be your sister, brother, dad, and mother too. Pretty baby, oh, pretty baby. Won't you come and let me rock you in my cradle of love? And we'll cuddle all the time. Oh, I want to love this baby, and it might as well be you, dear, pretty baby of mine.
Some of the more fashionable working women of the day could be found in a section of New Orleans called Storyville. The nation's most famous red light district for over 20 years, Storyville was America's capital of joy and jazz. But in 1917, the U.S. Navy established a major base near the district and ordered Storyville closed down for fear that our sailors would be corrupted. In addition to its lovely ladies, Storyville was renowned for the great musicians who frequented the area. Men like Kid Ory, King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and dozens of others grew up in New Orleans, developing that uniquely American form of music known as jazz. The beginning of a new era in the sound of American music. But also in 1917, other eras would come to an end. William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, would die at the age of 70. Through his spectacular Wild West shows, Buffalo Bill was the man most responsible for bringing the legend of the American cowboy to the entire world. In the process, Bill made himself millions and spent them just as fast. He was penniless when he died alone in a Denver hotel room. Diamond Jim Brady, another American who evoked memories of a bygone era, also died in 1917. A millionaire railroad man, Diamond Jim became a world-famous symbol of the wealth and opulence of America in the gay 90s. Another American, one who would become the symbol of an era yet to arrive, was just coming into his own in 1917. A 35-year-old New Yorker named Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been pressed into service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt was known for being impatient with his superiors and tried, with only mixed success, to bring reforms to the Navy's wartime shipbuilding programs. 2 decades later, his reforms would change the face of America. When Americans weren't thinking about the war in 1917, a great many of them had their minds on baseball. It was then without rival as the great American pastime, and the year provided some memorable moments, especially for that fan in the upper right corner of the screen. Other great moments included the game in Chicago on May 2nd between the Cubs and the Cincinnati Reds. Chicago pitcher Jim Hippo Vaughn faced the Reds' Fred Toney in what had to be the greatest pitcher's duel of all time. After 9 full innings, neither Vaughn nor Toney had allowed a single hit. The first and only double no-hit game in baseball history. Cincinnati finally won with a run in the 10th inning. A few weeks later, pitcher Ernie Shore of the Boston Red Sox outdid them both. In a game against the Washington Senators, Shore became one of the few men ever to pitch a perfect game, allowing no opponent to reach first base with a hit, a walk, or an error. On August 19th, with a huge celebration, New York City opened its newest stadium, the Polo Grounds. The competitors in that first game were the Giants and the Reds, but the big news came after the final out. 2 baseball immortals, managers John McGraw of the Giants and Christy Matheson of Cincinnati, were unceremoniously arrested for allowing their teams to play. It seems that August 19th was a Sunday, and it was apparently overlooked that in 1917, playing baseball on a Sunday was against the law. If baseball was America's favorite outdoor sport in 1917, the movies were rapidly becoming the nation's second favorite indoor activity. Despite the fact that films were often jittery and scratchy and devoid of sound, the motion picture industry in 1917 was undergoing a boom that would be surpassed only by the growth of radio and television a few decades later. At the beginning of the decade, Hollywood was little more than a sleepy Southern California retirement village with a few churches and country stores. By 1917, nearly 60 companies were cranking out over 1,000 miles of movie film a year. And across the country, some 25 million people a day were plunking down their hard-earned nickels and dimes and even quarters to catch a glimpse of those flickering images. Hollywood had become the free-swinging, big-spending hometown for some of America's most famous and highest-paid personalities, some of whom were earning up to $500,000 a year, at a time when America's average income was $610 a year. The undisputed king of comedy by 1917 was a filmmaker named Mack Sennett, whose madcap Keystone Cops had been delighting the nation for over 5 years. Sennett called his Hollywood studio the Fun Factory, and it produced some of the biggest names in early Hollywood history. Fatty Arbuckle, Ben Turpin, and Gloria Swanson all got their start with Mack Sennett. And so did a little man with a mustache who would not only become the king of comedy, but the king of Hollywood. Charlie Chaplin would become perhaps the greatest star in the history of the movies. And by 1917, he was making $650,000 a year. One of the films he made that year, Easy Street, is still considered a classic. And if Charlie Chaplin was the king of Hollywood, the undisputed queen was a shy young beauty named Mary Pickford. Her real name was Gladys Smith, but by 1917 she was known simply as America's Sweetheart and was voted that year's most popular star. Another 1917 superstar was the swashbuckling Douglas Fairbanks, and his storybook romance with Miss Pickford was the joining of two legends. It became an international sensation. After their marriage, Pickford and Fairbanks moved into a Hollywood mansion which they named after themselves. They called it Pickfair. It became the setting for some of Hollywood's most glamorous parties. In the 1980s, Pickfair was purchased by millionaire Los Angeles sports figure Jerry Buss, and local jokers promptly renamed the mansion Buss Fair. But in 1917, the combination of Pickford and Fairbanks was no laughing matter. The dashing Mr. Fairbanks was building a reputation as the movie's greatest hero, and it would continue to grow with films like Robin Hood. And The Mark of Zorro. In Zorro, Fairbanks portrayed a mild-mannered dandy who secretly became the fearless swordsman who protected the poor and the downtrodden. The highlight of the film was Fairbanks' duel with the evil Spanish governor of California. Fellow died like a man. Hey! Ha! Oh! Hey! Oh. Yeah. Perhaps we should take a time out here for a moment. Mr. Fairbanks, you've clearly inherited the family athletic ability. Can all Fairbankses fence?
No, there are not many of them left. They all got stuck.
Athletic ability seems to have run in the family. Does it go back even beyond your famous father?
Oh, I think so. I think I was the only one, actually, who ever took up fencing as a sport. Actually, my father didn't take it up till much, much later, and then for professional reasons, I took it up as a sport when I was about 16.
Now, you actually were in both silent and non-silent films.
I was indeed, sorry to admit.
One of those who survived the transition.
Yeah.
Did you have to learn to act a whole other way for talkies?
No, because I'd been on the stage, too. You see, I started on the stage both when I was in my early teens.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a film like this that we just saw, people just saw on the home screen, is it anything like the speed that it was played at? Or did you move faster than normal or anything?
The audiences of the day saw the film in natural speed, but the projectors were so timed as to run at normal speed, which is very difficult to do now because it's arranged mechanically and electronically, but it should be normal speed.
I never realized that what we see as the jerky silent films were, in fact, at normal, realistic
X number of frames a minute went through the camera, and the camera itself was controlled manually.
Yes.
The cameraman was able to turn the film fast,
Speed up or slow.
16 frames a minute, 24 frames a minute, whatever, or a second or whatever it was.
Films like we saw your father in, and you also did swashbuckling films, although you had a greater range, apparently, than your father had, or at least were allowed to play in more kinds of things.
I kept away from him deliberately. I refused to accept any job that was anything like that until he had been retired for a great many years. and sound had since come in because this great period was the silent period. And then I really didn't get into it until after he died. I started while he was still alive, but in a quite different way.
The studios, of course, cashed in, I'm sure, as much as they could on the name at first, trying to force you into another.
Only the very first film, and I was so young I didn't know it. From there on, it was hard to get a job at all.
Yeah. You're often referred to, speaking of swashbuckling, as the most honored actor in his military service in World War II. But I've never heard any details of that. Does that refer to decorations won in combat?
I suppose.
Yeah. Is it something you're reticent to talk about?
Well, it's sort of embarrassing, isn't it? Talk about oneself. Either you do it jokingly and you run it all down so it means that the people who are nice enough to do it are insulted, or you blow it up and then it sounds very conceited. Yeah. So the best thing to do is let somebody else read the citation and wonder if it's on the level or not.
This sort of thing in films, were you ever injured?
Yeah.
Stuart Granger got a sword in the mouth once.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I've got every bone in my fingers broken, not all from swords, but I've got scars all over my body, broken ribs, and all from movies. Now, I was 5.5 years in the war, 5 years in combat, and only 6 months just on desk work, and never got a scratch. But all my wounds and scars and broken, everything came from movies, which I find much more dangerous than the war.
I didn't raise my boy to be an actor.
Well, I think if you don't mind, I think there's enough of this idle chatter now. So if I can just take that away from you for the moment.
Have a care.
And, well, there we are.
Yes.
Now, on go.
Let's see what you're made of.
Oh, I hate to tell you.
That way, there's an exit open.
Okay.
Other stars helping to make the movies an $800 million industry in 1917 were a pair of saccharine sweet sisters named Lillian and Dorothy Gish, and a sultry sex symbol called Theda Bara, who was known as the Vamp. Her films evoked an aura of illicit passion and foreign intrigue, which wasn't bad for a girl whose real name was Theodosia Goodman and who was raised in the exotic city of Cincinnati, the daughter of a tailor. She chose the name Theda Bara because it's an anagram of the phrase Arab death. On Broadway, the biggest star of the day was the great Lillian Russell, while others who would gain fame in the movies and radio and even television were just getting their start. The Ziegfeld Follies was a smash hit at the New Amsterdam Theater, featuring such stars as W.C. Fields, Fanny Brice, and Will Rogers. Another star of the Follies was a comedian who appeared in blackface named Isidore Itzkovitz. He would later take the name Eddie Cantor. At another theater, an 18-year-old kid was getting his start as a dancer. His name was Frederick Austerlitz, but he would soon be known the world over as Fred Astaire.
Goodbye, Broadway, hello, France.
It was more than just a song. While the Broadway theater season was in full swing, hundreds of thousands of young men were preparing to leave home to fight America's first major war on foreign soil.
Goodbye, Broadway, hello, France. We're going to swear our debt to
By midsummer, the first of the 176,000 men who would sail to France in 1917 were bidding tearful farewells to their loved ones.
Oh, send me away with a smile, little girl, brush the tears from eyes of brown. It's all for the best, and I'm off with the rest of the boys from my own hometown. It may be forever we part, little girl, and it may be for only a while. But if fight here we must, then in God is our trust. So send me away with a smile.
By the war's end, a year and a half later, over 2 million American soldiers would leave for France. And despite the threat of German U-boats, only one troop ship would ever be sunk. But of course, no one knew that at the time.
It may be forever we and it may be for only a while. But if fight here we must, then in God is our trust. So send me away with a smile.
Despite the fear and discomfort of the 10-day voyage, the men seemed to take it with surprisingly good humor. Whenever possible, the decks were jammed with men working and playing to ease their tensions. They'd do almost anything to keep from going below, where the holds were jammed with bunks from floor to ceiling, and attacks of seasickness could reach epidemic proportions. General Black Jack Pershing arrived in June with the advance guard of American troops, to the obvious relief of his French hosts. The war was not going well. By mid-August, when enough soldiers had arrived to stage a respectable parade, a real humdinger was held in the streets of Paris. And for thousands of Americans, over there became somewhat frighteningly over here. Many of them, too many, were about to meet firsthand the horrors of war. But first, there would be the joys of France. With most of their young men gone for over 3 years, the women of France were as happy to see the doughboys as the French generals were to see Black Jack Pershing. Although there are no truly reliable figures, one U.S. official estimated that of the 2 million Americans who eventually went to France, fully 70% of them would have sexual relations with French women. The VD rate became scandalous, but apparently not many soldiers could resist a smile from a lonely mademoiselle.
Oui, oui, Marie, will you do this for me? Oui, oui, Marie, then I'll do that for you. I love your eyes, they make me feel so spoony. You'll drive me loony, you're teasing me. Why can't we parley-boo like other sweethearts do? I want a kiss or two from our chérie. Oui, oui, Marie, if you'll do this for me, then I'll do that for you. Oui, oui, Marie.
But of course, the doughboys' main job was to make war, not love. And despite their brief training in the States, the men were in no way prepared for the realities of trench warfare. Using all the modern miracles of the day, the men were lectured to by phonograph records and assaulted by a weapon never before used in the history of warfare, the training film. This is one of the very first. Perhaps more to the point, the doughboys were given practical training in the fields and trenches of France. No large number of American soldiers would see any real combat until the following year. But for the French and English and Germans and others, the fighting was real, and it was deadly. In battles like Gallipoli and the Argonne and Verdun, casualties far exceeded anything previously known in the history of warfare. In the Battle of the Somme alone, the combined British, French, and German casualties reached 1,250,000, about equal to the losses suffered by the entire British Empire during all of World War II. The result of that battle, incidentally, was an 8-mile advance for the Allies. Much more romantic, but just as deadly, was the war in the air. Practical airplanes had been flying for fewer than 10 years when the war began, but they quickly became fearsome weapons. And no pilot was more feared than a one-time supply officer in the German army named Manfred von Richthofen. His men called him Der Rittmeister, but to the rest of the world, he was the Red Baron. Before he was finally killed, the Red Baron shot down 80 Allied planes, 25 more than the number of planes in the entire U.S. Air Corps at the start of the war. He remains the leading ace in the history of aerial warfare. A short time after von Richthofen's death, he was replaced as leader of his squadron by another young German pilot, Hermann Göring. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading ace, would not see combat until 1918. When he did, he would shoot down 26 German planes in just 7 months, flying his French Spad fighter. No American-built plane ever flew in combat during World War I. Another legendary name connected with events in 1917 was that of Grigory Efimovich Rasputin, the Mad Monk. Described as an unwashed, lecherous goat, Rasputin exerted such an evil influence over Russian Tsar Nicholas and his wife Alexandra that 2 noblemen finally murdered him. But when the killers went unpunished, after openly boasting of their deed, it was taken as a sign of weakness by the Tsar's many enemies. As a result of Nicholas' tyranny and indifference, Russia had long been on the brink of starvation. And whether or not it was Rasputin's unpunished murder that gave his enemies the courage, rioting broke out in February of 1917. Hundreds of demonstrators were shot down in the streets, but the unrest continued. By March, Nicholas was forced to abdicate. And within a year, he and his family would be killed by the revolutionaries. 10 centuries of Russian monarchy had come to an end. A few days after Nicholas stepped down, Nikolai Lenin returned from his exile in Switzerland, and the Russian Revolution, perhaps the most far-reaching event of the 20th century, was underway. Back at home, however, some Americans at the time were more interested in a revolution taking place in the unlikely confines of Coney Island. It seems that a 25-year-old short-order cook named Nathan Handwerker touched off a weenie war by selling hot dogs for 5 cents apiece, half the price of any place else. And not only that, Nathan's hot dogs tasted better, too. His competitors spread the word that Nathan's dogs were cheaper because he used bad meat.
One to go and hold the sauerkraut. I mean the Liberty cabbage. Nathan shot down the rumors by hiring local college boys dressed as doctors, complete with stethoscopes around their necks, to crowd around the counter and eat the suspicious sausages. And it must have worked because over 65 years later, they're still around at about 20 times the original price. And that's our trip through 1917. From the Polo Grounds to Gay Paris, it was one of the most exciting and eventful times in American history. And one of the most important stops along the road to yesteryear. And for Yesteryear, I'm Dick Cavett.